Okay, today we're going to enter into chapter 25, section 3, which is going to talk about how the industrial process or industrialization spreads. And the first place that it stops at is going to be the United States. Capital letter A talks about resources. We talked about Britain having all of the possible resources to industrialize. The United States also had this possibility. And so the United States possessed both the natural resources and the factors of production to industrialize. We had a supply of workers that was steadily coming from farmers, former farmers, and immigrants. During the War of 1812 really made a major change on the American economy because during this war, the British, they placed a naval blockade on the United States, and this limited our international trade, basically forcing us to utilize our own resources and to develop our own industries. The industries would manufacture the goods that the United States could no longer import from other countries. Now, because of that, you had industrialization beginning in the United States. As we've talked throughout the year, in my position, I believe that this is actually a positive for the economy because it forces you to put jobs on the market in your own country and create goods on the homeland. Capital letter B talks about the industrialization process in the United States. Once again, it began in the textile industry. The British kind of had a monopoly on this and they wanted to hold on to that. So therefore, what they were doing is they didn't allow their engineers, mechanics, or even tool makers to leave their country. In 1789, though, a man named Samuel Slater left Britain and came to the United States, and he built a spinning machine all by memory based on those that were in England. This kicked off the first series of factories in the U.S. Many young ladies, teenagers, moved to what were called factory towns and began working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day as what they called mill girls for decent wages. This was a much better option for them than serving as house servants in rural towns and cities. In the northeast of the United States, textile mills, clothing manufacturers, and shoe manufacturers came about. So you can see here that this is the time period, 1800s, early 1800s, late 1700s, that United States industrial progress began. Capital letter C, later expansion of the U.S. industry. Despite the industrialization of the early 1800s, the United States remained agriculturally based really until after the United States Civil War in 1865. In the late 1800s, there was a technological boom. A wealth of natural resources, including oil, coal, and iron, were found in the United States. Inventions such as the electric light bulb and the telephone came about. The railroads also expanded in the United States and helped boost cities like Chicago and Minneapolis. Chicago had really a lot of cattle at that time, a lot of stockyards, and Minneapolis had a lot of grain industries, a lot of farming was going on in that part of the country and then spread to other parts. Capital letter D is going to talk about the rise of what are called corporations. It costs a lot of money to build railroads. So to create money, entrepreneurs show shares of stock in their companies. Stock is where buyers have certain rights to ownership in a business. People who bought stock became actual partial owners of the said business. Corporations are businesses owned by stockholders who share in the profits but are not personally responsible for its debts. So this is very similar to what we learned about earlier as joint stock companies. But with joint stock companies, when you put your money into, like, let's say, an adventure or an exploration, if the ship crashed or got raided by pirates or all the people died on the plantations that they built, then you lost all your money. In corporations, you can only lose what you put in. And that's one of the interesting things here. So the risk is a little bit lower in corporations and investing in stock today than it was when you would invest in joint stock companies back in the 14 and 1500s. Some of the large corporations of the 1800s included Standard Oil by John D. Rockefeller, Carnegie Steel Company, founded by Andrew Carnegie. These are examples of what are called big business. Big business are giant corporations that control entire industries by reducing the cost of producing goods. This made for larger profits. We still see this going on today. Now, one of the things I would say about all of this is there's a lot of valid information in the supplemental videos that I've been giving you on the gradebook page. So please, it is mandatory that you watch those videos. to help understand and get a visual on some of these big picture topics. Roman numeral number 2, continental Europe also began to industrialize during this time. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars between 1789 and 1815 really hurt the economy in Central Europe and part of continental Europe, which means Europe without considering Great Britain. It interrupted communication and caused inflation in many parts of the continent. Despite this, though, industrialization eventually reached continental Europe. One of the first places that it starts is Belgium. Another escapee from Britain named William Cockerell illegally made it to Belgium in 1799. He brought with him plans for building spinning machinery for textiles. This was the first step to industrialization in Belgium, which eventually led to steam engines and then railway locomotives. Next would be Germany. Germany then industrialized a little bit later. By this time, the British were actually willing to sell their equipment and allow their engineers to work outside of the country. This is really interesting because what the British decided to do is basically they're saying, if we just let these plans sneak out of the country, we're really making nothing out of it. So why don't we actually sell our plans? We'll send our engineers there and we can make money off of this. This is kind of like a basketball team during the NBA trade deadline, trying to trade a player who they know is not going to re-sign with them. So they've got a guy who's going to become a free agent. Rather than lose him for nothing, they try to trade him to get maybe a second round pick or something like that. German manufacturers also sent their workers and children to England to learn about how to industrial manage these different factories. Germany's resources were scattered about in many locations, therefore making it necessary to develop an extensive railroad system. By the late 1800s, a unified imperial Germany had become both an industrial and military giant based on its economic strength. Roman numeral 3, talk about the impact of industrialization. Well, really it led to a rise in global inequality. There was a very wide wealth gap between industrialized and non-industrialized countries. Industrialized countries began to seize overseas colonies for their economic resources. This is a time period that we'll learn about in a few chapters ahead, called Imperialism. It's the policy of extending one's country's rule over many other lands. So there really was a race to conquer territory and gather the resources necessary for industrialization by exploiting the other countries. This was going on. European countries were taking over parts of Africa, South America, parts of Asia, and it's really looked at as a time period that isn't so pleasant. Capital letter B, the transformation of society. Between 1700 and 1900, all right, so got a little bit cut off there at capital letter B, the transformation of society. Once again, I'll go over the whole thing. Between 1700 and 1900, revolutions in agriculture, production, transportation, and communication changed the lives of people in Western Europe and also in the United States. Population, health, and wealth eventually increased tremendously due to the industrialization process. And then finally, despite the many benefits, other countries chose not to industrialize. We'll take a look at those countries in section 4. Roman numeral 4 in your textbook has a brief summary of all of this information. It can be found on page 742. To close things off, gentlemen, your homework for tonight and would it be due tomorrow is actually to read chapter 25, section 4, page 734 to 740, but also to write the section outline. You can find that posted in the assignments. And then also, one of the things that I want to make clear is that this section is really about socialism, communism. Karl Marx is in there. So it's a pretty important section that compares capitalism and socialism / communist ideas. So make sure that you're taking detailed notes and that you type the notes up. It's much easier to upload the notes if you type them, save